Welcome to another Telltale Books video. I'm Greg, and I'm going to talk now about the first serial from Weird Tales that I'm breaking out into its own video. And I'm doing that because, first of all, serials being spread over a number of issues, I don't want to try and talk about them when I'm talking about the individual issues, because then I have to break it up into pieces and I can't talk about the whole story. But the second reason is that this particular serial turned out to be pretty interesting, pretty significant in my opinion. Not a top tale, but it's still worth talking about and worth you seeking out and reading it. And that is it's a novella that was split into two parts in the May and June issues 1923 of Weird Tales. And it's written by someone named A.G. Birch, and I really can't find anything more about this author. Wrote this one story, no other information that I can find. So I just have this one story to go by, and nothing more I can tell you about A.G. Birch. Is a complete mystery in the history of literature. I don't know if it a lot of these, because I mostly get my information for things in the science fiction, horror, fantasy genre. I start with the Internet Speculative Fiction Database, isfdb.org, or is it .com? I forget. But they are, really way better for information than even other sites about literature. I mean, if you're trying to find something out about a non-genre writer, like, say, Thomas Hardy, famous British literate author, or D.H. Lawrence, try to find an absolutely complete bibliography that lists all the short stories along with information of where that story originally was published first. You're not going to get it. But in the science fiction, horror, and fantasy field, the isfdb.com gives you all that information. So that's always my first start, especially for genre writers. And in this case, they usually have links off to Wikipedia articles or the Science Fiction Encyclopedia, the Fantasy Encyclopedia by Peter Nichols. Those are both online now, as well as other sources. And for Weird Tales authors, there's a site that it usually gives a link to that lists all the different Weird Tales authors and tells everything they can find about those authors. And apparently they don't have a page for A.G. Birch. Now, that doesn't mean that Birch didn't write anything else. A lot of times, especially with these early Weird Tales authors, I'm finding only listings for a couple stories in the ISFDB, but I find information that these authors wrote a lot of stories for Western pulp magazines, mystery pulp magazines, but there's no comprehensive list of stories for those kinds of magazines. So finding a bibliography of those other types of genre stories is very, very difficult. So that said, The Moon Terror is all I got. I know nothing about the author. I know nothing about any other stories. He may have written hundreds of stories for Western pulps, say. But I got nothing telling me that, and nothing leading me to any kind of list of those stories. And of course, with Telltale, we're not interested in being genre specific. We do like a lot of the science fiction, horror, fantasy genre, and so that's the majority of what we've talked about so far. But we really want to be genre independent. We don't want to be a channel for just science fiction, or a channel for just horror, or a channel for just fantasy, or even a channel for just speculative fiction. We want to, if we feel like it, if we feel we have come across a significant work in the romance genre, we want to review it. If we come across a significant work in the Western genre, we want to review it. If we come across a significant work of literary fiction, we want to review it. If it's poetry, we want to talk about it. If it's nonfiction, we want to talk. We don't want the shackles of having to serve a genre. So, I really do want to have complete bibliographies of all the different types of stories that an author wrote, and not just have information about science fiction, horror, and fantasy. But science fiction, horror, and fantasy are really the best documented areas of literature. So that's where I'm able to get the best information, and that's why, because A.G. Birch only wrote this one piece for Weird Tales, that's the only story I have any information about for A.G. Birch. Okay, cut a long story short, I just don't know anything about him other than that I read The Moon Terror, and I can tell you about The Moon Terror, which I'll start doing right now. Basic synopsis. And really, this story is pretty remarkable. Remember, this is the May and June issues in 1923 of Weird Tales. And the story starts out where the earth is being shaken by these mysterious earthquakes, very devastating earthquakes, but they come at very regular intervals. You could set a clock by them. They always come at the same time, and they always last the same amount of time. And then comes a broadcast to the whole world from a mysterious genius sorcerer / scientist from China. I forget what his name was. I didn't write it down, of course. This guy sends a message that everybody needs to evacuate a certain area of the earth, mainly lands bordering the North Atlantic. So cities like New York and London, they need to evacuate. And he tells them how far away they need to go. So, of course, some British, I think they were part of the army, but there's some scientists that lead an expedition on a ship to China to try and find out what's going on. And they do, and they find this. It's not just one sorcerer scientist. It's this hidden society deep in China that is separate even from the Chinese people, Chinese government. And they've been in seclusion for well over 2,000 years. And their story is that apparently a long time ago, China was peaceful and prosperous and ruled over by this princess, but there were 2 moons in the Earth's sky. Well, then, for some reason, one of the moons disappeared. And at that time, China went into a period of basically bad luck. Wars, pestilence, famine, stuff like, lots of problems with China, and they never really recovered from that. And this society has been working in secret, developing extremely advanced sciences way beyond what anybody else has ever done. And they've perfected the science to allow them to carve out a part of the earth and put it up into orbit. They're going to bring back the second moon because their mythology says that when that second moon is restored, China will go into a period of peace and prosperity. And they want that for their people. But of course, it's going to be catastrophe for England, Europe, United States, lots of people. Because that's where he's carving all the rock out to make this second moon. So the expedition, like I say, it's armed, they have a warship, they're being led by some very intelligent scientific type guys, but they're also affiliated with the military from Britain. And they go over to China and they find this guy and they figure out what's going on, and they look for a way to stop him. I don't think it's much spoiler to say that they do put a stop to it and keep him from breaking off part of the earth. So the first thing about this story is, of course, this comes long after Sax Rohmer started writing his Fu Manchu stories. So there were 4 or 5 Fu Manchu novels already out in publication at the time that this story hit Weird Tales magazine. And, the story, I mean, you could replace the word China with any other nation and get the same story, except except the author chose to use China, and at this time there was already a long history, and Sax Rohmer was not the first. There was already a long history dating back to the Boxer Rebellion of authors who wrote these yellow peril stories of Asians rising up with armies and trying to take over the world. Politically, it was England and the United States that were being the aggressors during the Boxer Rebellion, but that didn't cause people in the United States and England to write sympathetic stories about China, except for Pearl S. Buck. Everybody else was characterizing them as these evil villains, and so the Fu Manchu character became very popular, really caught on, and has become synonymous with evil Chinese warmongers trying to take over the world. These kinds of stories are sort of a forerunner to James Bond stories, where there's always this evil scientist working in seclusion with this plan to take over the world, or at least take a lot of money. So it's like I say, if you were to just replace all the references to China in this story with some other country, you'd have the same story, essentially. But the choice of using China at that time, 1923, came from a prejudice in U.S. and British society against the Chinese and against Asians in general, which produced a very large body of literature of these yellow peril stories, which is unfortunate because, like I say, replace China with any other nation, you have just like a James Bond type story. You've got a really good adventure story and actually a science fiction story, because they're using super science to try to carve a moon out of the earth and put it up into orbit. This is very much a science fiction story. And that's the important part about this, is that to the best of my knowledge, Sax Rohmer didn't go this far with science in his Fu Manchu stories. A.G. Birch wrote a story about super science that's able to create worlds. You know, this is the territory that would be dominated by Edmund Hamilton when he started writing a couple years later. And actually, I mentioned in my recent review of Across Space by Edmund Hamilton, which was published a couple years later in Weird Tales, that aside from the fact that the secret society that the heroes were fighting against originally came from Mars, Edmund Hamilton's story is very parallel to the Moon Terror, to the point where I think he must have read and been familiar with this story before he wrote Across Space. And of course, Across Space was just the first of many stories following a certain formula. So the Moon Terror comes out of one tradition but starts a new tradition and really starts pulp magazine science fiction in 1923, 3 years before Amazing Stories, 3 years before anybody else was writing anything like this. The Moon Terror got published. That makes me see this as pretty remarkable, and the fact that the story is just pretty good. It's not a great story. Characterization could be stronger. The writing could be more literate, but for an adventure story, it's perfect. For an adventure story, it's what you want. It's actually better than a lot of other pulp science fiction stories that come after this. It's not as good as what H.G. Wells had been doing not too long before this, but, you know, that's always the big question is, after H.G. Wells wrote his stuff, why weren't there very many people able to do better than Wells until you get into the 1940s? And you could argue that you really need to get into the 1950s before people really started topping Wells at doing science fiction. So there was this long period after Wells wrote his scientific romances that people just really didn't learn much from Wells. They were trying to write stories inspired by that scientific romance idea, but they weren't getting what makes Wells so compelling in most cases. And even the Moon Terror kind of falls short of that. But this is one of the best examples of what was being done in between H.G. Wells and the Golden Age. Most of the rest of it was really bad. Okay, so like I say, the Moon Terror is the only piece that I know of from A.G. Birch. It was published in 2 different issues of Weird Tales, the May and June 1923 issues, which, of course, any issue of Weird Tales is going to set you back hundreds of dollars to get it in reasonable condition. They're highly sought after. It's a legendary magazine, so original copies, you can get them, but you better get out your wallet. It's going to set you back. The Moon Terror, along with Ooze from the first issue of Weird Tales, and a couple other early Weird Tales stories, were collected together into a hardcover book titled The Moon Terror that was published in 1927, and copies of that are available. I did check online. You can get them for, I mean, it's an old book. You're not going to get it dirt cheap. To get a decent copy of it, you're going to pay a little bit of money for it, but not a huge amount of money. Not bad at all. I contemplated getting a copy, but ultimately I came across a different avenue, and I felt that as much as I like the Moon Terror and as much as I like Ooze, I don't want a slightly damaged original copy of a book with those stories. I wanted a nice, brand new, but cheaper book with the stories in. And that's where Wildside Press comes to the rescue. They mostly publish print on demand. They keep a lot of really old stuff in print, but it's print on demand, and so they do it fairly cheaply, and they just print trade paperbacks. But they're not poorly done trade paperbacks. They're all right. They're decent. These aren't collector items, but just so that you can have a nice copy in your library to be able to read, these are good. These are more than good enough. And they don't publish the entire original hardcover contents. They just do the Moon Terror and Ooze, just those two in this book. But that's really, those are the two best. Those are the two that I wanted in my library. And so I went with this route. Can't remember what I paid for it, like $16.95 or something, and not bad at all. Standard trade paperback prices today. And the illustration on the cover is a reproduction of the illustration from the original jacket of that original hardcover. And exactly what story it illustrates is anybody's guess. I mean, it's kind of Oriental and kind of secret society-ish, so most likely was intended to illustrate the Moon Terror, but at no point in the story did I read anything about any woman, clothed or not clothed, being chained to an altar and somebody stabbing her with a sword. That doesn't happen in the story. So, kind of a neat black and white illustration. Not sure they did a great job with the typography with it, but it is the original illustration from the hardcover edition of the Moon Terror from 1927. So this, in my opinion, was the best route for me to go to have a copy of the Moon Terror for my library. And of course, I get a brand new book out of it. You can't beat it, and I get it for not a lot of money. You can't beat that. It's the perfect combination, for something that's not a top tail. So that's the Moon Terror. If you like pulp adventure, I would recommend this to you. I think it's really good. I think it's also, like I say, it's coming out of the tradition of the Yellow Peril stories, the Fu Manchu stories, but it's morphing it into what would become the standard for pulp science fiction adventure through the 1920s, 1930s. And as I've said, you can even see echoes of this story into the James Bond stories. So historically, this story is pretty remarkable for where it stands in the development of science fiction and pulp adventure and spy thrillers and a whole host of things. It's an interesting story. It's a good story. It's worth looking up and reading. Worth at least going to Wildfire Press and getting this trade paperback. Like I say, I didn't think it was worth it to buy the hardcover from 1927, even though it's not too badly priced. It's still a lot more expensive than the Wildside Press route. So that's how I chose to go, because that's good enough for what this story is. So, I know it's unlikely, but have you read The Moon Terror by A.G. Birch? If you haven't, go out, get a copy of this Wildside Press book, read it, come on back, leave your comments. Otherwise, if you already read it, leave your comments. But tell me what you think of The Moon Terror. Do you think I'm right about this? Do you think it's an enjoyable pulp adventure standing in a point of important development in the early pulp science fiction evolution. Leave your comments. And that's the only A.G. Birch I'm ever going to write, because that's the only one I know to exist. I'm ever going to read, I mean, because that's the only one I know to exist. So I won't be back with anything more by A.G. Birch, but I will be back with lots of other stories, authors, topics. Emily will be joining me every Friday. Friday is Emily's day. I get her to shoot just enough videos with me that I can put a video with Emily on every Friday of the month. And sometimes I can get a little bit more than that, but I at least have her committed to doing enough that I can make her appear on the channel every Friday night, or every Friday period. They go up in the early morning. So come on back and join us for all the other stories that we talk about. And we're going to be talking about a lot more from Weird Tales, a lot more before Weird Tales, coming up in the 2025 year. This is early in 2025. We got a lot more cool things to come. So I hope you'll join us.